our pod racer rig is finished. It's now time to bring it to life, and we will start our first animation lesson by covering the basics of setting keyframes in Max. This scene is animation start in your project files. I'm going to go ahead and right click in the perspective to activate it, and then press Alt W so we can just focus on this camera. Okay, so again, it's time to bring this pod racer to life, and by the end of this we're going to have this really cool animation where it's following along a path or animated along a path to create a fly-through for the pod racer. Alright, with that said, let's go ahead and start with the basics. Now, before you begin animating, it's very important that you first check your time configuration panel. Alright, that's found next to the time parameter, okay, at the keying panel or animation panel. If we were to go ahead and go right next to the slider, here's the time configuration dialog. Alright, so here's where we are able to tell Max what frame rate we like to choose for our animation. If you're working in film, you want to go ahead and use the film setting, 24 frames per second. Okay, games, NTSC, 30 frames per second. It's very important that you change this first before you get into animating, because if you, let's say you're animating at 30 frames per second and realize, oh no, I need to actually animate in 24 frames per second, your keys on the timeline will offset. So imagine if you're working on this really complicated animation, you're just about done, and then you realize, oh wait, I need to change the setting. It can be very cumbersome to go ahead and fix those keys. So make sure you set this at the start. Alright, we also cover the other settings in here in our Intro to Animation course. So if you're interested in delving further into animation, I'd recommend you exploring that course. Alright, but with that said, I'm going to go ahead and just choose OK. We will be using film 24 frames per second, so let's go ahead and choose OK. Alright, there's a few other things you want to check. Being that we want to animate with smooth interpolation or smooth transition from key to key, what we want to do is check our default in and out tangents for new keys. That's right next to the set key button. Let's go ahead and left mouse button click and hold that down. And notice we have different settings we could choose from. We also covered this in Intro to Animation. The one we want to be concerned with is that last one, the set tangents to auto. Alright, that will give us smooth interpolation. And lastly, what we'll want to do is go ahead and go to our set key filter and just make sure that everything is checked on that we plan to animate. So for example, let's go ahead and select our engine control. Notice we have under the modify panel, we have this custom parameter, engine rotation, and that's what we're going to animate first. You can move that slide around and get an idea of what this does. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to want to make sure under our set key filters that we have custom attributes checked on, so we can save keyframes on this custom attribute. Now what I also like to do is uncheck those parameters that are just going to clutter up our timeline that we won't necessarily have any key set on. So the IK parameters and also the scale. Typically I just leave position and rotation, but if you plan on animating the scale, go ahead and make sure that's checked on. Alright, so with these three set, we can go ahead and close this out, and we're now ready to begin animating. And if you notice, down at the track bar we have the auto key mode and we have set key. We're going to explore auto key a little bit later on, but let's go ahead and turn on set key. Now, with set key mode, we have an order at which we need an order that we need to follow when setting keyframes. Okay, that order is as follows. We'd first change our time, so go to the time we'd like a certain pose to land on, and then we'd pose our character, or in this case, pose our pod racer, and then the last step would be to go ahead and set the key. If you don't do this in that order, you can run into an issue where your poses are not set, because again, Max doesn't have that info stored. So we're going to go ahead and actually cover this order, and I'll show you what happens when we don't follow the order. Alright, so making sure set key mode's turned on, let's go ahead and get right into animation. Alright, I like to start with frame 1 and use frame 0 as just a way to store our default pose for our racer. And this is just so that if we ever need to, we can get back to that default pose just going into frame 0. Alright, so with that said, we can hold down Control Alt and the left mouse button, and notice we can, if we drag over to our left, we can actually change the start time of on our timeline. So I'll go ahead and drag until our start time is at frame 1. If we use the right mouse button, we can drag that end time. Alright, but I'm going to go ahead and drag this to frame 300, and notice I'm pulling to the left to do that. If you pull to the right, you decrease your frames. Again, so that's Alt, Control, and the right and left mouse buttons. Okay, great. So now that that's done, we'll go ahead and get right into setting keys. Alright, so I'll go ahead and select the left engine, and let's say on frame 1, we'll go ahead and move our engine rotation to, let's say, just a different value to add rotation. So again, we choose our frame, we change our value. I'll just go ahead and just kind of shift this just slightly, not much at all. Let's say to about frame 7, or to a value of 7, that is. And now we can set our keyframe. For custom attributes, we could either use this set key button, which is tied to the set key filters dialog. Okay, so notice we can set that, and that'll store the key. Or if you want to do this a little bit cleaner, I'll just go ahead and undo that key that was set. Notice how the engine pops back, so we'll need to put that value in again of 7. Another way is to hold down Shift and right click on the time slider. So notice only a key was set on that parameter. And this is great for just setting keyframes with a clean workflow, so you don't have a clutter to deal with in the end. Alright, so we have our first key set. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and move to another frame and set another keyframe. Let's go to frame 20 this time. I'm going to move to frame 20. Okay, we could use these arrows to go through each frame. And on frame 20, I'm going to go ahead and now break the order. So I'm just going to go ahead and, let's say, move the engine to a different value, but I'm not going to go ahead and set a keyframe. So now notice what happens. As we move the timeline, our engine will pop back to that value, okay, to the key prior. The reason why is because we didn't tell Max to store that pose. So that's the importance of following that order. Alright, so let's go ahead and choose our time. It's frame 20. Let's go ahead and change our value. I'm going to change the value here to, let's say, about negative 19. Alright, so we could always plug that in, or just simply move the slider until you get to negative 19. And then we can go ahead and hold down Shift, right click. And now the key is stored. So now we should see our engine shifting back and forth, or rotating back and forth. Okay, great. So now we're going to go ahead and set our last key, and that's going to be on frame 40. All right, so we'll go to frame 40, and let's go ahead and move this back, let's say to about a value of 10. All right, so we'll go to 10, hold down Shift, right click. So now if you notice, when we hit play, we have our engine rotating back and forth. But what would be nice is to have that continue throughout time, throughout the range of our time. Right now it doesn't do that. So what's great is that in Max we can actually cycle our animations, and we will be getting into cycling an animation very shortly, and we'll also cover tips that we always want to keep in mind when cycling animations. Alright, but with that said, again, we've covered the basics of setting keyframes. Now, one more thing I'd like to show you is this. If you're animating, make sure you're either in auto key or set key modes. Notice, if we go ahead and turn off set key mode and then just change our engine position, it is not going to set a key. What's going to happen is this is actually going to offset our animation. So it's going to offset it by this value. So what that means is that, notice as we scrub the timeline, it's not going to shift those engines back to that previous key. Instead, it's going to keep this offset. So you'll still get the engines rotating, but notice they're at an offset now. So that's very important to keep in mind. Make sure when you're animating, you're in set key or auto key modes. Now, if you need to quickly offset your character or whatever you're animating, go ahead and turn those off and do it that way. All right, but the safest way is to go ahead and make sure that you're in one of the key modes. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo back, pressing Control Z until we were at a value of 10. Alright, so that's very important to keep in mind. But with that, that's going to finish this lesson, and in the next lesson we'll start covering some info on Max's curve editor.